So, my name is Marko. You can find me on the internet at Freitzel. I'm a web developer. I've been going to UX conferences for a lot though. I worked at Parsec, Zemanta, and DeckReport, and now I'm CTO at Cube Sensors. And I want to talk to you about responsive design. Web design is responsive design. Responsive web design is web design done right. So if you're not yet doing responsive web design, you're designing web pages for a fixed size, which is not what the internet looks like. Because every other user has a different size of the browser. So the idea behind responsive web design is to create one version of the site, code and content, that responds to the limitations of the environment it's viewed in, not the device. So you're not doing a website for iPad, iPhone, and the desktop. You're doing a responsive site that will respond to any environment it's viewed in. One of the things that you need to think about when you're doing responsive web design is devices and contexts. Devices are not contexts. Devices are desktop computers, laptops, tablets, phones, other devices coming out, say the fridge, a microwave, or whatever. TVs. While contexts are where you're looking at a web page, why are you looking at it, what the speed is, stuff like that. So you might be in a bar waiting for other people to show up, checking Foursquare email when the conference is going on or whatever. You might be on a bus on your way to work, in a queue at a post office. The thing is that devices don't necessarily mean the same thing. While on a bus on my way to work, I can be using my phone to check the sites, I can be using my tablet, or I can be using my laptop. The assumptions people make when viewing contexts or devices are usually connected to connection speed, location, focus, and input. So you might see a person using an iPad, and you go like, oh yeah, they're going to be using their fingers, but they're actually using a Bluetooth keyboard, so the input is not necessarily weird. Common misconceptions are that when you're on a laptop, you have a speedy connection, while you're on a mobile phone, you don't. And obviously, that's not necessarily true, right? Also, one thing is that often people think that if you're checking a site on a phone, you're probably on the go. How many of you check websites on the phone when you're at home? Yeah. All right, so I want to go through some stuff about how you do responsive design. So I want to first figure out who all of you are. So hands up if you're a developer. Hands up if you're a designer. Front-end guy, HTML and stuff, sort of. Who wants to look at code? All right, good, we're good. Awesome. So we're gonna go through 5 things that you need to know when you start doing responsive web design. Oh, who's doing responsive web design already? Awesome. Awesome crowd. All right, so the first thing to know is goals. Who are your users? What are their needs? How are you meeting their needs? The goals should depend on the business goals of the business you're working for. Is it the client or your business or whatever? But make sure you always set SMART goals. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time sensitive. If you don't do that, if your goal is to just make a better user experience, then you can always argue it's better than it was before, but you never know how far you need to go. So make sure that you set goals that are measurable, so that you can actually, after you're done, you can actually go and say, we achieved this goal, we failed at this one, we need to work on this one. The next thing is content. How many of you do websites where content is the last thing that comes in? Yeah, not the way it should be done. How many of you were at yesterday's session about UX? Make people give you content before you start working on the site. If there's no content, you're just drawing boxes, you're just drawing pretty shapes, and you're not working on the goals. So the questions you should be asking people if they're not doing this themselves is, what kinds of content do we actually need? What's the tone of the content? How will it be adapted to different sizes? So, for example, TV Guide in the States figured out that when a content writer is writing a review of a movie, that they actually need to be writing 4 reviews. One long form, one shorter, one abstract, and one sort of just a title thingy. So think about what you're going to do on the website, and think about providing more ways of people actually providing you content. Because the automatic version of, I'm just going to use first 200 characters or first 50 words or whatever, is really not the optimal solution, usually. The last thing is, how is the content structured? So you want to think about, if you're going to have titles, abstract, and long form, and short form, and stuff like that, you want to think about that before you start drawing boxes. Because that's really important. It's going to define your content that's coming in, it's going to define your lists, it's going to define your pages. Everything sort of revolves around the content that you're trying to convey to the user. All these things should end up in a content matrix. If you've never used one, Google for content matrix and you'll find lots of examples. And they're also part of the content strategy. There's been a lot of sort of talking about that. There's a lot of books coming out. So if you always get the content last, buy yourself a content strategy book and give it to your client as a gift. Because then they might actually think about, well, we're not actually just making boxes and filling them up, but we're actually building stuff around content. All right, the next thing that you might do after you have the content, you know, the goals, you start doing the structure, right? So it's all about importance of pieces of content and UI and the relationships between them. What you usually do when you're doing structure is sketches, wireframes, prototypes, and comps. Who's doing sketching? Pencil, paper, drawing boxes? No one? Seriously? Are you drawing that in your head? Well, that works if you're in a small team or just doing stuff alone. Wireframes. Wireframes, people sort of think they're obsolete, but they're really good for representing content relationships, even though they're sort of static, just boxes and stuff like that. Then you have prototypes. So you're out of Photoshop, you're doing HTML stuff. That sort of works, but it's not connected to anything. It's still sort of boxes, but you're basically prototyping basic interactions. So if you're doing something where you don't know if users are going to understand how to use that drop-down search form something, you can do a prototype and get that to the users as soon as possible in the development process to see if it actually works. comps are basically high fidelity everything, so you can just say the front end is done, right? So it's something that's basically fully done that the client can see, and it's sort of like the thing that you're going to use in the end. So after you're done with the structure, so you have boxes, you have basic interactions done, you're doing the design. Who thinks it's weird that design is this late in the process? Hopefully no one. Because the design is, well, it's going to make things pretty. That's what people usually think. But what you're actually building is a system. So it's not poster design, it's not a book design, you're designing a system that defines the rules which govern the change of the layout with respect to the viewport. So people, like even before responsive design became a buzzword and became really popular, people were using grids to design websites. That's why usually the responsive system is connected to the grid system. So you might have 4 columns, but then if it's narrower, you have 3 columns, or you just skip to 2 columns and stuff like that. So this is they sort of go hand in hand. If you noticed, again, it's about responding to the viewport and not the device. There is really no easy way to communicate responsive design to the developer. So if you think about a page with 10 modules and say 4 breakpoints, and then the different modules break at different values, so they each might have 2 or 3 states. That's a lot of comps. That's a lot of Photoshop designs, or there's a lot of work to show that, right? So you can use the Breakpoint Matrix. The Breakpoint Matrix will show you the breakpoints. You can download the thing from the URL or check the slides after the talk. So it will define breakpoints, and it will define modules that are in there and how they're going to break at different breakpoints. So if you're doing the structure and the design, this is what you need to be communicating to your developer, to your front-end developer, so they go like, oh, okay, so at this width, the search box is going to become smaller, or 1 column, or whatever. So it's easy to update, it's fast, and everybody can understand what it's saying, right? So you don't need to do like 25 Photoshop files for different widths. You just do one and just set up the content in the matrix. Now I want to talk about breakpoints. How do you set breakpoints? The frameworks that you might use set breakpoints at values where the first popular devices were when this hype started happening. So you might have breakpoints for screen sizes. I'm just listing Apple devices. Apple is not famous for releasing loads of devices, but still on this screen, there should be a lot more screen sizes, right? And if you want to do breakpoints for all of them, like even if you just do the small ones, right? There's like iPad has 2 screen sizes, actually has 4 because when you're opening stuff in a web app, it's different sizes. iPhone has 4 at least, if not 8. So you actually don't want to do that. Don't check devices. Using device sizes for adding breakpoints is wrong, because you don't want to be catching every latest release of every phone to go like, oh crap, we have the mobile size for 360, but now Samsung came out with a 400 width phone and they're getting a tablet design, oh crap. what you want to be doing is thinking about content. Look at the content, add breakpoints where it makes sense for content to break. If you're doing a grid-based design, then it's usually going to be nice numbers where the grid sort of makes sense to break. Also, you still know that a lot of people come from a specific device, optimized for that device. So even if you might be breaking at 800, you know that you have a lot of visitors using 768, optimized for that too. Go through your stats, go through your analytics, figure out what the sizes are where people are really common, and make sure that those sizes look great. A few examples. This is an online radio station where the breakpoints are defined by the column widths, the album covers. So things break at different breakpoints for different parts of the site. And you can see that they're not the common, 240, 360, 768, 1024, and more. They just go with the content and figure out where they need to break. The next example is the online wine guide. Again, you figure out where they need to break so that you can optimize for the content that you're using, so that you're not using loads of weird sort of short form breaking stuff. Just make it break where it makes sense to break. So people that want to see code, this is it, development. I'm going to talk about frameworks, add media rules, feature detection, and deciding on how you do layouts. So frameworks. How many of you use a responsive framework? All right. Bootstrap. Foundation. Anybody knows Gridset? I think you should. All right. So most of these frameworks are actually not just responsive design frameworks, but they have features for adding breakpoints, or they have breakpoints built in. Most of them have a grid-based module, and most of them have a bunch of other stuff, so buttons, forms, stuff like that. The problem with frameworks usually is that they will often decide for you when to break, and they will often force you to do that and make it really hard for you to fix the breaking, to move the breakpoints. So stay away from frameworks that don't allow custom builds. I will just give you a big file for you to include, because if you're going to optimize your site for speed later on, that like 50K of CSS, that's not gonna make your work easy. Sort of connected to that one is stay away from frameworks that aren't small in size. So if they're not small, most likely they're just giving you way too much stuff to work with. Also, another thing that's becoming really important recently is stay away from frameworks that are hard to customize. If you can't set up your own colors, if you can't set up your own breakpoints, it might not be the best framework to use long term. I mean, Bootstrap is awesome for bootstrapping a website and getting it up like in an hour. But then later on, when you're trying to make something custom, it's really a pain in the ass. That's why you need to know how this all works, right? The basic thing that you need to know with responsive design is add media rules. This is how you tell the browser to make something different at a different, say, screen size, browser size, viewport size. This is only for only shows you max width. So when the width is lower than this, do something else. But you can also do a lot of other CSS properties. It's not really common, but you can. And what this is saying is base font for the size is for the site is 16 pixels, right, in the browser. But if the viewport is smaller than 600, make it 14 pixels. Why? With the computer, the screen is further away, usually, and with the phone it's closer. So you might want to make the font size smaller. But that sort of, again, depends on what the context is where your users are using the website. So test, ask users, and figure out if that makes sense. So this is saying, I did all the CSS for the desktop size, and for mobile, I'm going to use an add media rule to set different styles, right? You can make it the other way around. You can say, I'm doing the CSS for mobile, and I'm using add media for bigger screen sizes. So you're basically doing stuff mobile first, which makes sense in some cases. It doesn't make sense in others. There's a whole book about this if you want to read more about it. So with this, if screen size is more than 600 pixels, apply the CSS. Making it a bit more difficult, adding more media rules. Mobile first, so use 14 pixels for all the screen sizes that don't support add media. Where it's at least 600, use 16. And if it's more than 900, use 18. Sort of makes sense, right? Does it make sense? Any questions? No? Awesome. But make sure if you're using source order to apply media rules, make sure you do it right. Because if you do it this way, it's never going to be applied, right? Because it's going to say, all right, so it's more than 900 pixels, but it's going source order, so it's applying 87.5, then it's applying 112.5, but then it's also applying 100. So this one will never apply. So if you're doing source order, make sure you do it right. It's smart to decide if you're going mobile first or desktop first when you're starting off the project, so you have all the media queries in the right order. You can make sure you're not hitting into source order issues if you're only doing properties that are changing. So you can do this. You can say, just apply this when it's more than 600, but less or equal than 899. This will work, but it's gonna give you problems if you'll be doing this. So you'll be repeating all the properties that you want applied on all sizes. Or you're gonna add another media query for all over 600, and then it might get confusing after a while. As I said, it's not about responding to screen size, right? So it's responding to the viewport. As some of you probably know, viewports also have different pixel density. So what you want to do is probably say adding a high-res logo that is basically double in size, adding it as a background and then telling it that the size is smaller in the background size. Anybody sees a problem with this? No? Remember Internet Explorer? Some of it doesn't support background size. So what this will actually do is it's going to support at media, it's not going to support background size, and then you're going to have a big problem because the logo, you're only going to see the top left quarter of the logo or center or whatever your background position is. Unfortunately, it's not this simple. It would really be awesome if it was. It actually looks like this. So basically every browser has its own idea of what the pixel density property should look like. Why am I using 1.5? Anybody know? Because obviously iPhone is 2.0. There's phones somewhere in between. About 1.5 is where you can actually figure out the difference from a low-res to high-res image. It sort of depends also on if you're doing images that are pictures or are you doing icons and logos. You don't really care much about pictures, but icons are really important because usually you make them small and it's really nice if they're crisp. So as I was saying with the background size thingy, you can do feature detection. Feature detection, basically there's one really good solution for this. It's called Modernizer. Anybody knows Modernizer? Yeah, all right. So it's basically a library that will give you options to test for all sorts of browser features, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, stuff like that. It has a configurable production build, so you can just say, I just want these 3 tests. But even with that, it's sort of, it can sometimes be too big for what you want to do. So just go to their GitHub page, find the test, and incorporate it into your own code. You're going to get lots less code, but it's still going to work. But the thing is that feature detection is often actually not needed because of CSS and HTML features, right? With CSS, if you're specifying a property that is not supported, it's just not going to apply it. Also, if more or less, if you don't really care about IE6, you can basically just say, okay, I'm going to do this property, so set the background color, but then set the background color, say, with transparency. And if the browser doesn't understand the value, it's going to ignore it. It's just going to keep the previous value. And with HTML, I hope you guys all know that basically if a tag is not supported in a browser, the browser is going to ignore it. So when you're doing HTML5, say video tags, if you put a link in there, if video is not supported, the link's going to show up. So a lot of time you don't actually need to test for does it support video, but just add a link there and it's going to apply automatically. So the last thing in development I want to talk about is deciding on fixed, fluid, and elastic layouts. Fixed is obsolete. We're not designing A4 pages, we're not designing books, we're not designing posters, billboards, or whatever. What we are designing is websites where every browser has different width, different height, pixel density, even color depth, stuff like that. So everything is dynamic, right? Fluid is based on percentages, and it's the stuff you should use most. So even if somebody's asking for a fixed width site, use the fixed only on the outer container. Do everything else inside with percentages. What this is going to do for you is that after, say, a half a year, when they read an article in, I don't know, whichever magazine they read, and go like, hey, can we do this the responsive way? Because I hear it's really cool. And then you go, yeah, sure, we just remove this and add some media rules to add breakpoints, and we're sort of done. You don't need to actually tell them it's that easy, because then you're going to make way more money. But you know, you can decide on that later on. If you're going to be doing responsive on a fixed page, that's going to give you way more headaches. So elastic layouts are based on ems. That's sort of a measure of font size. You want to do that, you want to use that when your UI depends on texts a lot. So there's, for example, Flickr's sidebar. Everything in there is basically text. It would make sense for them to use ems for the column width, because then even if your font size in your browser, say, is bigger, you're still gonna get like 3 or 4 tags in a row and not like break at each tag. So one of the tricks that you can use is when you're developing sites, always have the zoom full page off. Just zoom into text and make sure that 2 steps up and 2 steps down always work. Or grab your CEO's computer or your friend's computer and change the font size for them. They're not going to notice. But they'll be mailing you, oh, this breaks, looks weird, it goes out of the box. Probably everybody here knows the CSS is awesome mug, where awesome is sticking out of the box. That's what you don't want to see on your production website, right? If you know more about doing multi-unit layouts, there's a great article from Eric Mir about that will show you basically how to use that in any layout that you wish. But you might ask, some things are fixed, right? So you have images, you have pictures that are fixed, you have video that is fixed. How do you do that in a responsive website where everything is sort of fluid, right? Content is going to flow, but the video is not going to stretch by itself. Anybody has a solution for this? So use background size contain for cover, yeah? Yeah, it's not IE friendly, yes, correct. All right, so what you do is basically use some tricks. You can do this, so you can say, there's an image, but it needs to be 100% wide. Might not be the best solution, because obviously then on a huge screen, it's gonna be really big, and it's also gonna scale the height of the image. So if you're just specifying width, the height is gonna go up, depending on the ratio. So you might wanna do this. Say, set up a max width. So make sure that it grows, but then after it grows too much, you just stop it. The nice thing I hear about Drupal is that version 8 has a picture module where you can set up different sizes. So you can load different size images, which might be really cool, because this is one of the things that most people can solve easily, because it means making new images on the server and you just don't want to go there. So if this is, check out the module, and if this is really as good as it sounds, use that. Because you're going to have an advantage over most of the other people where this is not built into their framework. The other thing that you can do with images and with videos is use this thing that's called intrinsic radius for videos. It's basically a trick where the padding height is, if you specify it in percentages, it's going to be a percentage of the width. So doing this is actually going to make the wrapper 4 to 3. So the height is going to be 3 times as if the width is 4 times. So this actually means that you can use a YouTube video and include it in here, and simply it's going to stretch, and it's always going to be in the right ratio, right? It's not really all that simple, because the video is going to stretch, but the Chrome is going to stay at like, what, 30 or 40 pixels or whatever. But there's more properties that you can use. So say padding top, set padding top to 45 pixels, and you get the container for a YouTube video that's going to stretch forever. There's a nice article about this. It's not all that difficult. There's some IE tricks that I left out. But most of it, mostly because it's an older article, it still thinks about IE7. Most of us probably don't anymore. Anybody works with clients in Japan or Asia? Good, good. So you don't really care about IE7 anymore, probably. The other options, as we were already saying, is using background size cover or contain. If it's really important to you that the people with the latest browsers get the feature, use Modernizer to test if it supports it, and then add the CSS later on. You can also use, if it's okay to cut the images, so say you're using sort of weird imagery from stock photos or whatever to add next to your, say, ROI article. It's usually okay if not the whole image is seen, right? So just set up a container, overflow hidden, add the image there. It's going to disappear, it's going to be cut, but who cares, you know, it's just an empty office with a hand next to a computer or something like that. If you want to know more about responsive web design, you can read it in a book. It's by the guy who wrote the first article called Responsive Web Design. It's a good book. Then you have responsive patterns, which is really good when you're thinking, okay, so I have this navigation, and I want to figure out what the navigation, how I can make the navigation narrower, say on phones or whatever. So there's a list of patterns that you can use for different stuff in the UI. Say you probably know the pattern where the navigation is hidden behind the 3 lines button, or where it becomes a drop down or stuff like that. So the site lists loads of patterns like that. So if you have a problem with a UI that you don't know how to solve, you can go there and find the solution there. And there's a really good weekly newsletter, Responsive Web Design Weekly. If you just Google for that, you're gonna find it immediately. There's a bunch of articles that they write basically every week, interviews, features. So you don't need to actually, if responsive web design is not the thing that you do all day, every day, this is really a good way to sort of follow the discussion. They're just going to send you like an abstract of the discussion every week. But the thing is that responsive web design is not the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Right? Not everything should be responsive, probably. So how to decide if you're going to do a responsive website or an M.dot website, where you're going to do a special mobile site or a special tablet site or whatever. Write down the things that users do on the desktop version versus the mobile version, or whichever other version you're working on, TV version or whatever. Order the tasks by priority, popularity, or whatever your metric is. Compare. So connect the tasks on the left to the tasks on the right. If it's all fuzzy and crisscrossy, you probably want to do a mobile website separate. Because if most of the users on mobile use a feature that's really not popular on a desktop, then with responsive web design, you're just going to make sure that they can't find that thing because it's all the same website, right? If they're sort of okay. If most of the lines are sort of straight or just like few ups and downs, then you're good. Then do responsive for everything. But even if you go m dot, build it responsive. Not all phones have the same resolution. So you might be doing a thing for, say, anybody has a Samsung Galaxy S4. Anybody knows what the width of the browser is? Because it's now full HD, right? Usually they split it by 2, so that's going to be 5 something. 5 what? 560, 580, whatever, 540. And iPhone is what, at 320? That's a lot of difference, right? So you might want to think about even like doing everything fluid, doing everything responsive, even if you're setting up for just like a mobile website. The important thing here, what I want you to go away with is this. You've got to start with the customer experience and work back toward the technology, not the other way around. If I'm a user of your website, I don't care that you're using Drupal. I don't care that you have problems with CSS. I don't care that my browser's old. I want a good customer experience. Let me have it. Thank you. All right. Up for questions? So the question is about percentages in a fluid design for margins and paddings. Yes, I will do everything in percentages. And if you check my CSS, it's going to look really, really weird because all the percentages are going to be like with 8 decimals behind them. There's a solution for this that you might have seen in the framework slide. So if you're using CSS precompiler, Sass or Less, you can define your grids there with full numbers, and it's going to compile into long, sort of really long percentages. The other way, of course, is specifying them in pixels, but that usually means another wrapper. So basically your choice. It sort of makes sense to make them in percentages because if you're at 1,000 pixels, you might want it 20 pixels wide, but if you're on a phone with 320, you don't want to be spending 40 pixels just for the spacing, right? It sort of also doesn't make really sense because the column is going to be narrower and it doesn't need that much spacing around it.
Isn't it better to define different margins for the different screen size?
It might be. So if you wanna go with pixels, just change the margins in media queries. I usually just do percentages because then the margins scale down with column width. But usually, like if you're changing the grid, then you might want to like change the margins after you're changing the grid. So, but it really depends on the design. If you're using say grid set, that will let you use different grids for different in different breakpoints. You can specify the pixels in margins, pixels and margins in pixels, and paddings in pixels or percentages or whatever. So it's basically your choice. I usually do them in percentages, but you know. Yeah.
Are there any standard percentage for so 135.5?
It's the easiest way to do to figure out what the percentages, what the font sizes should be with different devices is to use your, say, desktop computer, and then use your device, hold your device in a sort of normal length from your eyes, and then sort of try squinting a bit, figuring out if the font size looks the same. For me, I started using really small sizes for phones and figured out that they're way too small. So I don't think I'll ever use less than 14 on a phone again, because you know, users with phones not all of them have high resolution phones. So giving them something like 10 pixels is really going to do this. What the hell is this? So yeah, I'll use 16 pixels for the screen, maybe 14 for, at least 14 for the phones. Other questions? If you're doing mobile first, IE7 doesn't support that media queries, right? So if you're doing mobile first, you're basically giving them at least, like, not the optimal solution, but it's at least usable. So I used to refer people to the Yahoo browser support thingy, but I don't think they're updating that anymore. So I'll go, okay, so for IE7 it needs to be usable. So it's more like book style, not a lot of advanced features, basically just single column reading stuff. The same thing goes for older devices. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing mobile first, but you need to think that your CSS without the media queries produces something that is usable. So recently I've been thinking a lot about putting all the media queries into a different file. So you can just like comment that out and see what users that have older devices or IE7 or IE6 or whatever, what they're going to see. And a lot of testing, obviously. Good? Anybody else? Yeah.
I wonder if you set borders or paddings in percentages, is there a problem of this blurred line on the borders?
So blurred lines on the borders if they're in percentages.
Or do you always think in pixels, but then you convert them to percentages?
The browser will convert everything to pixels. What the browsers don't do really well is when there's a sort of half pixel thing, it might sometimes it might be 2 pixels and sometimes it might be 1 pixel, which is sort of bad for consistency, right? So if it's really small, if you're using like 1 pixel borders, I use a trick where you specify the border in 1 pixel, but then use left margin minus 1 pixel, so it sort of, you're still 0 on percentages, so it doesn't break. But it sort of depends on what you're doing, right? If it's really important to you, add another wrapper, add a pixel there, and you'll, like, display block will still do everything that you need. There's really no good solution for that still, but you know, there's a lot of layout features in CSS coming up. We'll see how that's going to turn out. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. No. So I don't ever use max width for videos or iframes. Not sure why. I don't think it really works properly in all browsers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Max width on iframes and videos. All right. All right. Interesting. I don't think I ever used max width on videos. I don't know. I think I had problems with it in some browser. might have been IE7 or whatever. Yeah, I usually do intrinsic ratios for videos and sort of different things on images depending on what I'm looking for. There's a bunch of tricks that you have in your bag when you're doing this stuff a lot, so just pick out the first one, and if it doesn't work, try the next one. All right, any more questions? No? Huh? All right.
I'm wondering how the device pixel ratio comes up for the media query.
The browsers, unfortunately, so the question is regarding media queries and device pixels. The browser is going to always tell you the width that it sort of decided on, not the real size of the device. On S4, yes, you don't have the HD resolution, but the previous, like S3, used pixel density 2, which meant what? There was 800, so it was 400 in width in the browser. If they're going to use 2 again, it's going to be 540, right? And that's going to be like dividing that by 320 for the iPhone. That's a lot of difference, right? I'm thinking they might use 2.5 because the screen size is the same, right? The physical screen size. I don't know. I mean, the fact that browsers calculate their own viewport size and that when the site is not responsive, they adapt sort of the viewport, stretch it or whatever. That's sort of really problematic when you want to know the freaking screen size. I don't ever use M-based media queries. Not sure why though. I don't do a lot of text-based stuff, so it sort of doesn't make sense to me. And also, you sort of get problems if you're doing M-based media queries when on a normal screen stuff goes out of screen, and that sort of acts weird. Yeah, just for sort of small pieces of content in like navigations or whatever. All right, all right, I'll give you the last one. With Zen grids? No, sorry. All right, thank you very much.